Right now, inside Iran, two things are happening at the same time. On the streets of Tehran, Iranian citizens are beginning to hunt down members of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. A Basij member named Mohammed was stabbed 14 times and killed by masked individuals near Tehran 2 nights ago. Multiple car bombs detonated across Tehran that same night, and thousands of miles away, in a building in Washington, the United States Treasury Department was putting the final signature on a new operation that no one outside the highest levels of American financial intelligence saw coming. It is called Operation Economic Fury. It is designed to do to the Iranian regime's bank accounts exactly what Operation Epic Fury did to its military. And together with the naval blockade that has already strangled Iranian oil exports for more than 36 hours, it forms a three-sided vise closing around Tehran from directions the regime is no longer positioned to defend. The Iranian economy is dying in real time. Iranian elites are watching their foreign bank accounts get frozen in real time, and Iranian citizens are taking matters into their own hands in real time. The next phase of this conflict will not be decided in the Strait of Hormuz. It will be decided inside Iran itself. And the window for Tehran to control that decision is closing faster than anyone in the regime is publicly willing to admit. Subscribe right now and turn on notifications, because situations like this evolve by the hour. And when a regime begins to lose control of its own territory, the story you hear tomorrow morning may be the one that defines the next decade of Middle Eastern history. To understand why what is happening inside Iran right now is so dangerous for the regime, you first need to understand what happened on February 28th. That was the day the United States and Israel launched coordinated air operations against Iran, beginning what the Pentagon designated Operation Epic Fury. Over the 46 days that followed, the structure of Iranian power has been systematically dismantled. The military has been degraded. The proxy network has fragmented. The Strait of Hormuz, Iran's most valuable piece of strategic leverage, was first weaponized by Tehran and then seized from Tehran by a naval blockade that went into effect on April 13th under the command of CENTCOM Commander Admiral Brad Cooper. Every tool the regime relied on to project power beyond its borders has either been destroyed or neutralized. And now, with those external tools stripped away, the pressure is turning inward. Iranian citizens who spent 4 decades living under a regime that promised security in exchange for submission are watching that regime fail on every single axis simultaneously, and they are beginning to act accordingly. Now let us talk about what is actually happening inside Iran, because the picture is clearer than Tehran wants the outside world to see. 2 nights ago, a Basij member identified only as Mohammed was ambushed near Tehran and stabbed 14 times. His killers were masked. He did not survive. That same night, multiple car bombs detonated across the Iranian capital. Initial reporting was confused, with observers uncertain whether the explosions represented a resumption of American or Israeli strikes, despite the ceasefire technically remaining in effect. The confusion was resolved by the regime itself. An IRGC Basij commander published a video addressing the public directly, confirming that the detonations were not strikes from above. They were car bombs set off by what the regime described as hostile actors. His message, delivered in the unmistakable tone of an official trying to prevent panic, was that there were no casualties, that everyone was fine, that the situation was under control, that the brothers should not worry. The video itself was an admission. A regime does not publicly reassure its population that nothing is wrong unless something is very clearly wrong. An organized resistance is now operating inside Iran. It is targeting Basij and IRGC personnel. It is setting off coordinated explosions in the capital. And it is doing all of this under conditions specifically designed to prevent exactly this kind of activity. For more than 1,100 hours, more than 47 days by the time of the most recent count, the Iranian regime has imposed a total internet blackout across the country. More than 90 million Iranians have been cut off from the outside world. This is now the longest internet shutdown in the history of the modern internet. The regime imposed it for one reason: The memory of the protests that shook Iran in January, protests that the regime barely survived and only contained through brutal force, is still fresh in the minds of every official in Tehran. The internet blackout is a deliberate choice to prevent coordination, to prevent communication between Iranians and the outside world, to prevent another January from becoming another 1979. And yet, even under those conditions, the assassinations are happening, the car bombs are detonating, the regime's own officers are going on camera to reassure a population that has clearly stopped believing what it is being told. Simultaneously, the crackdown has intensified. Executions are continuing. Dozens of Iranians are being arrested every single day, many of them for nothing more than publicly criticizing the regime. The assets of arrested citizens are being confiscated outright, regardless of whether any crime was proven, simply because those citizens expressed dissatisfaction with the war. A regime that confiscates the property of its own citizens for speech violations while simultaneously unable to prevent bombings in its capital is not a regime operating from a position of strength. It is a regime whose internal coercion apparatus is working overtime precisely because the external threats have stripped away every other form of control. Now let us talk about the economics, because this is where the real clock is ticking. Iran's central bank is warning the Iranian government, in internal assessments that have begun to leak out, that full recovery from this war could take up to 12 years. 12 years. That is not a forecast of temporary disruption. That is a forecast of generational economic damage delivered by the regime's own financial authority to the regime's own leadership. The reason for that assessment is the naval blockade. Since April 13th, when CENTCOM implemented the blockade of all Iranian ports and coastal areas, Iranian oil revenues, the single largest source of foreign currency sustaining the regime, have functionally disappeared. Admiral Brad Cooper released a statement that cut directly to the core of what was happening. A blockade of Iranian ports, he said, has been fully implemented as U.S. forces maintain maritime superiority in the Middle East. An estimated 90% of Iran's economy is fueled by international trade by sea. In less than 36 hours since the blockade was implemented, U.S. forces have completely halted economic trade going into and out of Iran by sea. 90% of the economy halted in 36 hours, and the internet blackout that the regime imposed to prevent political coordination is now actively amplifying the economic collapse. Iranians cannot transact online. They cannot place digital orders. They cannot use credit card infrastructure that depends on external connectivity. The same blackout that prevents protests is now accelerating the economic strangulation. Every day it continues is a day the regime's own tools are working against it. And then there is the storage problem, which is where the mathematics become genuinely existential. Iran has roughly 50 to 60 million barrels of oil storage capacity across its national depot network. Approximately 60% of that capacity is already used. That leaves around 20 million barrels of spare storage. Iran is producing roughly 1.5 million barrels of crude every single day. Do the math. In approximately 13 to 16 days, Iran runs out of anywhere to put new oil. At that point, Iranian oil companies face an impossible decision: shut down the oil wells or allow the pumping infrastructure to rupture. And shutting down oil wells is not a reversible operation. Each time a high-pressure well is forced to shut down, between 5 and 10% of its long-term extraction capacity is permanently lost. The mechanics are technical, but the consequence is simple. Water infiltrates the formation. The bottom layer of oil becomes inaccessible for years. Every barrel that was in that layer becomes money that is gone forever. For a regime already desperate for every dollar it can extract, the prospect of permanently destroying 5 to 10% of its national oil reserves is not an economic crisis. It is a structural wound that does not heal within any political timeline the current regime can survive. Make sure you are subscribed, because what comes next reveals how the United States Treasury Department just extended this economic siege directly into the foreign bank accounts of the Iranian leadership. and why the money that regime officials have spent years hiding overseas may no longer be theirs to hide. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications right now. The economic crisis inside Iran has a historical echo that every official in Tehran is acutely aware of. In late 1978, less than a year before the Islamic Revolution, Iran's oil fields stopped producing. Exports collapsed. Foreign currency stopped flowing into the country. The Shah's government, which had spent decades building its legitimacy on the promise of economic modernization, suddenly had no revenue to sustain the infrastructure it had constructed. By mid-January of 1979, the Shah fled the country. He never returned. The Islamic Republic was born out of the vacuum that economic collapse created. That history is now sitting inside the briefing folders of every senior regime official as they try to calculate how long they can sustain operations without oil revenue. When the money stops flowing, the regime's machinery stops functioning. How does Tehran pay IRGC members without oil revenue? How does it pay Basij personnel? How does it pay the oil field workers themselves, the engineers, the shipping logistics staff, the massive bureaucratic infrastructure the regime has built over 4 decades? The answer is that it cannot. And if the money stops flowing for long enough, the same dynamic that consumed the Shah's government in 1978 begins to consume this one. The regime knows this. That is why the internet is shut down. That is why the executions continue. That is why the asset confiscations are being ordered. It is not confidence. It is the opposite of confidence. Meanwhile, the blockade itself is being enforced with a precision that CENTCOM has made a deliberate point of publicizing in real time. 10 Iranian vessels have attempted to breach the blockade since April 13th. All 10 have been turned back. Admiral Cooper's public updates have included operationally specific detail that is designed to send a message far beyond the strait. In one recent case, an Iranian vessel attempted to hug the coastline to slip past the blockade line into the Indian Ocean, almost certainly heading to China to sell the oil it was carrying. The Arleigh Burke-class destroyer USS Spruance successfully intercepted the vessel and redirected it back to Iran. The United States is not only enforcing the blockade, it is narrating the enforcement. Every successful interdiction is being published. Every Iranian attempt to evade is being documented. The intent is obvious. Every Iranian shipping company, every foreign buyer, every financial institution watching this situation is being given an unambiguous message. Nothing is coming in, nothing is going out, and the regime has no way to change that. Now here is the dimension of this story that most coverage is missing entirely. On top of the naval blockade, the United States Treasury Department has launched a parallel operation specifically designed to target the financial architecture that has sustained the Iranian regime's foreign holdings for years. It is called Operation Economic Fury. The timing of its launch is not coincidental. It went live within days of the naval blockade taking effect, creating a coordinated two-front economic assault that the regime was not structured to absorb simultaneously. The operation has 2 immediate components. The first is a formal notice to financial institutions around the world, particularly banks operating in jurisdictions that have historically served as transit points for Iranian money. Letters have been delivered directly to banks in China, Hong Kong, the United Arab Emirates, and other Middle Eastern countries. The message is direct. Any institution continuing to support Iranian activities will face secondary sanctions, a measure that effectively cuts the sanctioned institution out of the dollar-based global financial system. The Treasury Department described secondary sanctions as the financial equivalent of what we saw in the kinetic activities. That phrase should settle for a moment. The kinetic activities are the airstrikes that have destroyed Iranian military infrastructure for 46 consecutive days. The financial equivalent is what Treasury has just authorized against any bank that continues to hold Iranian regime money. The second component is the expiration of the short-term authorization that had permitted the sale of Iranian oil stranded at sea. That authorization was granted roughly a month ago as a pressure reduction measure during the early ceasefire negotiations. It is now expiring, and the Treasury Department has confirmed it will not be renewed. The sanctions relief that had given Iranian oil any pathway to legitimate international buyers is being allowed to lapse. What that means in practical terms is that finding a buyer for Iranian oil, already constrained by the blockade preventing physical export, now becomes structurally harder even in the theoretical case where Iran could evade the naval enforcement. And here is where Iran's own recent strategic choices come back to haunt the regime in a way that Tehran appears not to have anticipated. Iran spent months of this conflict attacking Gulf Arab states that had nothing to do with the war. Saudi Arabia was hit. The United Arab Emirates was hit. Qatar was hit. Bahrain was hit. Kuwait was hit. None of those states had given permission for American operations to transit their airspace. None of them were parties to the conflict, but Iran attacked them anyway. Before those attacks, Iran had relied heavily on the UAE's financial system as a transit point for evading American sanctions. The UAE's banking infrastructure had served as a conduit for Iranian money, moving through the global system, a gray zone arrangement that had persisted for years. Those days are over. The Gulf states that Iran attacked are now actively cooperating with Treasury investigations, volunteering to conduct deeper reviews of the funds held within their banking systems, and freezing assets associated with IRGC leadership and senior Iranian officials. The Treasury Department's position is that one of what may prove to be fatal mistakes the Iranians made was bombing their Gulf Cooperation Council neighbors, who are now willing to be much more transparent about the funds in their banks. The practical consequence is that the rainy day accounts that Iranian officials and IRGC commanders have maintained overseas, the safety nets designed to support them if the regime collapsed and they had to flee, are now being systematically identified and frozen. That is not a theoretical concern in Tehran right now. That is a live emergency. Every senior regime official who has quietly moved money outside Iran over the past decade is now watching the legal and financial infrastructure protecting that money disappear in real time, cooperation by cooperation, freeze by freeze. And now we arrive at the question that connects every element of this story. Diplomatic talks remain technically alive, but the structural problem exposed during the initial 21-hour negotiation in Islamabad has not been resolved. Pakistan's Army Chief, General Asim Munir, traveled to Tehran to deliver the latest American demands to Iranian leadership, attempting to bridge the communication gap that caused the previous round of talks to collapse. The American demands are not complicated. They are two in number. First, Iran must fully reopen the Strait of Hormuz, a requirement that was already part of the ceasefire framework and that Iran promised but has not delivered. Second, the next Iranian delegation to any peace negotiation must actually have the authority to sign an agreement. The previous delegation did not. After 21 hours of negotiation in Islamabad, the United States discovered that the officials across the table could not make binding decisions. The talks paused, not because of substantive disagreement, but because there was no one in the room authorized to say yes. That structural exposure of the regime's internal fragmentation was as damaging as any military strike. It revealed that Iran's public assertiveness is being projected from a state so internally paranoid that its own negotiators could not make secure phone calls back to their own capital during the most important diplomatic moment in years. Whatever comes next, whether the talks resume in Islamabad within the next week, whether an extension of the ceasefire is negotiated, whether a peace framework actually materializes, will depend on whether the real power center inside Iran, whoever currently holds it, can produce a delegation with the authority to act. The question that every American official, every regional government, and every financial institution is now weighing is whether that power center still exists in a form coherent enough to make a deal at all. The assassinations in Tehran suggest fragmentation. The car bombs suggest contested territorial control. The internet blackout suggests a regime that does not trust its own population to see the outside world. The The foreign-held bank accounts being frozen suggest a regime whose elite is already preparing contingency plans. When the regime's military is degraded, its economy is strangled, its elite's escape funds are frozen, its territory is contested, and its negotiators cannot make binding decisions. The strategic question is no longer whether the regime can win the war. The strategic question is whether the regime can survive long enough to negotiate the terms of its own ceasefire. Here is where everything stands right now. The naval blockade is fully operational. 10 Iranian vessels have attempted to breach it. All 10 have failed. Iran has 13 to 16 days before its oil storage capacity is fully exhausted, and the regime must either begin shutting down wells at permanent cost or allow the infrastructure to rupture. The Treasury Department's Operation Economic Fury has extended the economic siege directly into the foreign bank accounts of Iranian leadership, with letters already delivered to financial institutions in China, Hong Kong, and the UAE. The Gulf states that Iran attacked are now actively cooperating with American financial intelligence. Inside Iran, an organized resistance is assassinating Basij members and detonating car bombs in Tehran, while the regime's officers go on video to insist that nothing is wrong. The internet blackout has passed 47 days and made history as the longest in the modern era. The central bank is warning the government that recovery from this war could take 12 years. And the echoes of 1978 are sitting in every briefing folder in Tehran. Diplomatic talks are still technically alive, with Pakistani mediation continuing, and a possible meeting next week in Islamabad. But the regime arriving at that table will arrive with a hand weaker than any Iranian government has held in more than 4 decades. The Iranian economy is not simply under pressure. It is dying, in exactly the manner that consumed the Shah's regime 47 years ago. The Iranian military has not simply been degraded. It has been stripped of every conventional lever of power projection. The Iranian elite is not simply worried. It is watching its foreign escape funds be identified and frozen in real time. And Iranian citizens are not simply dissatisfied. They are now killing regime personnel in the streets of the capital. Will the next delegation Iran sends to negotiate actually have the authority to sign a deal? Will the regime accept a settlement while it still has any leverage left to trade? Or will it gamble on the internal suppression apparatus, holding together long enough to extract better terms? The answer will emerge within days, not weeks. And the pressure on that answer increases by the hour. Subscribe right now and turn on your notifications, because we will be watching, we will be analyzing, and we will be here for every development in this situation. Share this video with anyone who needs to understand why the next phase of this conflict will be decided inside Iran itself, and not on the surface of the Strait of Hormuz. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Do you think the Iranian regime can survive the combined pressure of economic fury, the naval blockade, and the internal unrest? Or is the current negotiating window the last chance Tehran has to secure a deal on any terms short of collapse? We will see you in the next one.